Okay, so welcome to the adoption and output session. For those of you who are newcomers to RDA, this is a standing agenda item for as a plenary session for our plenary meetings, and it's a moment where like all the plenary meetings, where the community get to come together, of course, collectively after being in the breakout sessions, but also to see the achievements of the working groups and the interest groups during that particular period of time. And so, and then we show some of the outputs, and we also try to show adoption, if you like, of these outputs. I'll go into that in a moment, but before that, I just wanted to reflect a little bit, because we are actually over halfway through this amazing virtual meeting. I've really enjoyed it personally so far. I found the technology platform very inclusive and easy to use. I found the meetings that I have been able to attend very, very enjoyable, and it's been so great to see so many people on the screen, unfortunately. So thank you, Bridget, for capturing some of the nice moments, and I just wanted to share them with you a little bit. So we can't get you all, but I think I might ask you, actually, rather than just doing a photo competition for of your ecology shots, which is important and nice too, maybe if you would capture and send us some of the screenshots. We'll have a collection, because of course we would normally have a photo gallery, and we would be able to have had lots of lovely pictures. So it might be an idea, but we have been happy snapping on the screen, as you can see. And here are a few more from our keynotes and our different things. Poor Juan is there. I think he was a little exhausted today after his panel speech, but very nice to see. And of course, here's one as well, Bob, one of our council members, in a reflective mode. What would happen normally in a plenary, of course, and this is the bit I miss most, is that we would all have bumped into each other in the corridor, and you would see everybody's faces, and you'd run up and you'd ask Yolanda or Mary or Gabby or Marcella or Megan some help or things, and we would all have interacted. All of the people in RDA work on 6-month cycles, more or less. We spend our time invested in doing everything that we can to make RDA a great community. And of course, it's largely virtual, actually, but the plenary meetings are the one moment that we all get the opportunity to meet up. And it's so, I say personally, it's so rewarding for me. Of course, it's my full-time job. It's not a lot of people's full-time job. In fact, apart from Bridget, if I'm not wrong, and Rebecca, who you see on the screen, most of the Secretariat, for example, share their time with Global and their regional offices or other work that they do. So our Technical Advisory Board are all volunteers, our council and our Organisational Advisory Board and organisational members. And as I said, it's a shame that we're not able to you know, you see the faces and things like that. So anyway, I think it would be nice in the latter part of the meetings if you could wave your hands and say hello if you are one of those board members or people who have more, shall we say, seasoned membership in RDA, and help our newcomers out, in the hope that they will stay, as I said in the beginning, with us on this wonderful journey that is RDA. So this lovely range of people are, of course, the people who are making it all happen behind the scenes, the RDA US office and the organising committee, and we are truly grateful to you. As we can't meet in the corridor or have a drink or anything like that, please don't feel that we are far away. We're just an email away or a chat away or a phone call away. So the most or the least I can offer you is that you can contact both the Secretariat and myself at any time you need. Depending on the time zone, we'll get back as soon as we can for all your questions and queries. And remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So please make sure you ask. On to adoption. So very briefly, before I introduce my colleagues who will speak after me, I wanted to just remind you of how we sort of speak sometimes about RDA. There's the business of RDA, which is a little bit what I described to you until now. The people that are behind the scenes working on a daily basis, the Secretariat, the Technical Advisory Board, all the other boards, the Council, to make sure that the organisation is sustainable and it works as professionally and as leanly and agile as possible. But all this is done, of course, to facilitate the heart of RDA, which is the work that you do, which is the work performed by you, the volunteer community that come together from all walks of life, all walks of data, all walks of science and research. And together we call that, if you like, the overall RDA platform. So it is the work of RDA that produce recommendations and outputs, and we categorize them in 3 ways. You will hear more about them afterwards, so I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but just to tell you that we actually are very proud to say that at the moment we have over 50 flagship outputs between recommendations and supporting outputs available for adoption. So adoption, I do realise, means different things to different people. And the context can be different, but the concept really is implementation, testing, take-up of, and successes and failures of the outputs that RDA has. So that's what we mean by adoption. So now I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Ryan O'Connor, who's going to give you some wonderful, only highlights, unfortunately, because we have so many things we'd like to say, but some highlights from Ryan to about the adoption in the last few months. And then afterwards, we will have the COVID working group panel discussion, which is a very concrete example and a very topical example of an output and outputs that can be and should be adopted. Ryan is a fellow Irishman, so I am actually Irish, though I live in Italy, and but I was born and bred in Dublin. And Ryan is a fellow Irishman who, like myself, does not live in his native country, but he did study there, English literature and psychological science in the University College Cork. And then he went on to do a master's in English literature in the University of Edinburgh, and then worked for a time in a media intelligence company, and now it works with the Digital Curation Centre as a research data specialist. And we on the Secretariat and in RDA are very, very lucky to have Ryan as the adoption and outputs coordinator and liaison. So with that, I will stop and pass the floor to you, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. I didn't realize I would have my "This is your life" section of the session, but yeah, thanks for that. So I'll just share my screen now. So my PowerPoint. So hopefully everyone is seeing that. I'll just put it in presentation mode. Is that okay? I see a thumbs up there from Claire. Okay, thanks again, Hilary. Thanks for the introduction there. So just to probably reiterate just what you just said. So my name is Ryan O'Connor. I'm a research data specialist at the Digital Curation Centre based at the University of Edinburgh. As part of my role, I've been involved with the RDA Europe 4 project, which wound up towards September of this year. And continuing from this, I'll be working alongside the Secretariat in coming months, promoting the adoption of RDA outputs. I'm delighted that the RDA has given me the chance to present to you today. I'm going to take the next 20-25 minutes or so to cover RDA's outputs, the role that they play in the organization, and to introduce you to some interesting cases where outputs have been adopted and implemented in different organizations. So the slides I'm using today are housed on Zenodo. The DOI is on screen. There's also a link on the Plenary program page for this session. The slides are linked there as well. So just click on the next slide. There we go. So before we move ahead to look at the cases of adoption, it is worthwhile first having a more general look at RDA outputs, RDA group outputs. So that, as Hilary noted just in her presentation, there are 3 types of outputs that RDA working and interest groups can produce as recommendations, supporting outputs, and other outputs. They're each slightly different in terms of how they are produced, but what ties the three types of output together is that they are, to quote the RDA website, the technical and social infrastructure solutions developed by working groups or interest groups that enable data sharing, exchange, and interoperability. So just to give a brief description of each, RDA recommendations are the outputs that are required from working groups at the end of their 18-month cycle. They will have been open to the community and to the RDA organizational assembly for feedback. They must be publicly available to those outside the RDA and participating organizations. And there must be documented instances where these recommendations have been adopted in at least 2 outside organizations or projects. And once they fulfill these criteria, they can be endorsed by the RDA Council as official RDA recommendations. So RDA supporting outputs can be produced by both interest and working groups. Again, these are required to be open for community input, but they don't have to go through the more formal review processes in the RDA, the Organizational Assembly and Council, nor do they have to be adopted as by other organizations to be recognized as supporting outputs. However, that's not to say that they can't provide successful cases of adoption, as some of the examples we'll look at later will show. So finally, there are other RDA outputs. These are the resources requested by working groups or interest groups to be published on the RDA site, but have received no level of endorsement. So this includes things like workshop reports, published articles, survey results, and the like. So for the rest of the presentation today, the cases of adoption we'll look at more closely are focused on recommendations and supporting outputs. So there's more information on the specifics of each type of output and the kind of where they come from and what the differences are even, and that is available on the RDA website. You can follow the link on screen. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware already, all the RDA outputs are the products of the combined efforts of experts and practitioners, and each respond to the needs of the wider community in some capacity. It's worth keeping in mind here the links to the wider community, as this is something I think that is worth underlining in terms of the value of RDA outputs in general. So if we consider the way that RDA groups respond to the needs of the community in developing recommendations and supporting outputs, how opening the recommendations and supporting outputs up to the community for feedback and comment is a key part of their development, and how they help to forge stronger connections with the wider community, we can see how effective the RDA is as an organization, as a forum, in combining the expertise and knowledge of its community of members. Okay, so now I'd just like to turn your attention to some of the adoption stories. As I said, now I won't present in detail, in much detail anyway, the work done by the organizations who have produced these. Rather, I'll try and give you an overview of the different ways that recommendations and supporting outputs have been implemented in different contexts, and hopefully give you an idea of how adoption is not simply a case of an organization sort of taking a finalized recommendation, supporting output, and kind of applying it to their work, but it's more of a sort of interactive and collaborative process. So yeah, so I've skipped ahead on the slide, but so yeah, the first thing I'll look at today are the adoption projects that were funded by the RDA Europe 4 project. So in mid-2019, as part of the RDA Europe 4 project, 6 proposals received funding with the aim of providing use cases of the adoption of 1 or more recommendations or supporting outputs. These grants were awarded to a variety of organizations and different types of projects. Some of these projects were ongoing projects. Some use the grants as seed money for work that is continuing on after the grant period. And some of these projects developed resources that are used by others in their specific domains. As you can see on the slide on screen, the organizations involved and their spread so they're geographically throughout Europe. And the organizations, they adopted a mix of recommendations and supporting outputs in their work. So early on in the project, it was decided by the RDA Europe 4 project partners that one way to sort of maximize the impact that these grants would have would be to put an emphasis on sort of communicating the outcomes of their funded activity. So this involved including specific requirements from the projects of deliverables that could be used to promote their work after the project ended, and these could also be used as examples to sort of help inspire adoption in other organizations. So to this end, input and assistance was available to the funded projects from the project partners in connection with the promotion and dissemination of the work, and also to help in facilitating input from the wider RDA community and beyond where this was necessary. It was also decided by the project partners that it would be of benefit for each of the to each of the projects to take advantage of the network of connections being established by other RDA Europe for initiatives, specifically the RDA Europe for the national nodes that were being set up, which were set up with a different round of grants. So just to give a few examples of this, the adoption project, which was based in Hungary at the University of Debrecen and the Library and Information Center of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. This project worked closely with the RDA national node in Hungary that was established during the project. Similarly, another one of the adoption projects, which was based at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center in Spain. And this organization was also the host organization for the RDA Spain national node. The RDA Spain node hosted an event towards the end of the summer, I think, at which both the Barcelona Supercomputing Center project and another adoption project, the one that was based at the Astrophysics Institute in the Canary Islands, they both presented on the work that they had completed under the RDA adoption grants. So as I said a few minutes ago, rather than looking in sort of any great detail at the individual projects and their work, it's worth pointing in the direction of some of the outcomes of these projects, where you can get a better idea of the variety of the different ways that the recommendations and supporting outputs can be implemented. There is on the RDA site, and there's the link is on screen, there's a page dedicated to the 6 funded projects. So each of the funded projects, as you can see here, the CCCA project highlighted on screen here, there is an introductory blog for each project that was put together by the RDA Europe project partners, a link to a webinar presentation for each project, the majority of which were recorded during the RDA Global Adoption Week in June of this year. And there's also the RDA adoption story for each of the projects. It's just 2 more elements that is worth highlighting in connection with the RDA Europe 4 project and general sort of RDA adoption. It's just worth considering, I think. The first is the CoData Data Science Journal Special Collection on RDA Results. This special collection gives visibility to research results and to the outcomes stemming from RDA activities in the form of research and practice papers. So as part of the RDA Europe 4 project, funding was made available to any submissions to cover the article processing costs of articles stemming from RDA activities. As mentioned earlier, as though the RDA Europe 4 project is now complete, the special collection will continue to be hosted by the CoData Data Science Journal and is still open for submissions from anyone from any part of the world who would like to submit any proposals. And the second thing, just to highlight, is the final RDA results adoption and take-up report. This describes the role of the RDA Europe 4 project in promoting adoption in relation to both the funded projects and all the other work around adoption that took place during the RDA Europe's lifespan. So the DOI and the link to that report, which is housed on Zenodo, again, is on screen. So the next thing we'll just briefly take a look at is a similar initiative ongoing at the moment, being funded by RDA US with support from the National Science Foundation. So as part of this work, 3 projects have received funding, and the full title of each project will be up on screen now in the next few seconds. The first one is based at the University of Pittsburgh, and this project adopted 4 different RDA recommendations. There's a project at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and this project has adopted the recommendations of the RDA Research Data Repository Interoperability Working Group. And then the third project funded as part of this round of grants is based at the University of Indiana and has implemented the data type registry recommendation and the recommendation on PID kernel information, PID kernel information. So the deadline for the work to be completed under this grant was extended recently enough, I think. That was extended due to the end of the year due to COVID. However, the third project mentioned there, based at the University of Indiana, has already published an adoption story, which is available on the RDA site. Just if you follow that link, excuse me. And there's also a recording of a presentation given during the Global Adoption Week on that project. A YouTube clip is on that same page if you follow that link. So yeah, you can keep an eye on the RDA website in the coming weeks and months for the for any updates or on the outcomes and impacts of these projects. Yeah, so moving on. Yeah, so the next topic we'll look at focuses more on an RDA recommendation that sort of continues to have a really significant impact in terms of the application of RDA results. So back in 2016, the Repository Audit and Certification Partnership Working Group published its recommendations. So this working group was originally a partnership between the ICSU World Data System and the Data Seal of Approval organization, although this latter organization was later replaced by Core Trust Seal, with the RDA as the forum for cooperation between the two. The recommendations that were published, or that was published under this work itself, has two parts. So the first part is the core trustworthy data repository requirements. With the second part is the catalogue of common procedures. So as it explains on the recommendation page, the aim of the work was to bring the organizations closer together with tighter integration and to collaborate on a certification framework that involves higher level standards. The requirements outlined in the first part of this recommendation have been updated since the first release, and there are more details on the Core Trust Seal website. And it also contains a really useful link which has an overview of the history of Core Trust Seal and its association with RDA. So as it mentions in this paper, the RDA principle of transparency and the sort of value of the participation and input from the RDA community was really important in the development of this work. Also, yeah, recently the Core Trust Seal announced that it has announced the 100th certified repository, which the Odum Institute Data Archive, based at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, helping it to hit the 100 mark. Excuse me. There's a map on the Core Trust Seal website, and the map contains all the certified repositories and gives a good idea of the sort of the geographical spread sort of throughout the world. Let's do a quick sip of water. So yeah, turning our attention back to adoption. So the repository audit and certification catalogs recommendation has resulted in 9 different adoption stories from repositories specializing in different disciplines from across the world. There are 2 stories based from organizations based in Australia, 1 apiece from Ireland, Netherlands, Germany, China, France, and Hungary. The final one from the Pan-European Social Sciences and Humanities Open Cloud project. Again, there isn't kind of time to look at these individual adoptions in any great detail, but I think there's 1 or 2 things worth highlighting. I thought there is the so yeah, the common requirements and procedures have been translated into Hungarian as part of the RDA adoption project based in Hungary, which I mentioned in the last section. And in their adoption story, the Chinese Astronomical Data Center noted that it has been providing data services to users for over 30 years. And they noted in this adoption story that the benefit of implementing this recommendation in this instance was to give a more kind of formal summary and documentation of the work done that has already been carried out in the organization to date. Finally, on this topic, I think there is a quote from the report that I referenced earlier on the history of Core Trust Seal. which says that Culture Seal remains a community-created, community-driven entity. I think this is something that's reflected definitely in the all 9 adoption stories, and it's something I think that can be applied to their work, their collaboration with the RDA as an organization as well. So I think we are just about halfway through, maybe just a bit over halfway through. So far we've just looked at some adoption stories where there's been some level of support from the RDA, be it in the form of grants, in some support from various project partners under various RDA project banners, and some support from the RDA as a forum to develop these standards and procedures. I think what is noticeable in these cases is that sort of facilitating the input of the community and harnessing the RDA principles of openness and consensus has been key to the success of all the endeavors we covered so far, and the ones we'll cover next. So as I said, now the next two, the final 2 topics even we're covering, we'll consider both these projects benefit in a sort of similar fashion from input from the RDA community and from the RDA as a forum for developing procedures and encouraging better data practices. So the final 2 topics we will look at are the adoptions of the DMP Common Standard for Machine Actionable Data Management Plans, and the recommendation for the framework for the curriculum for foundational research data science skills for early career researchers. Okay, so first to the DMP Common Standard for Machine Actionable Data Management Plans recommendation. So this was developed by the DMP Common Standards Working Group, but their recommendation was officially endorsed by RDA Council, I think earlier this year. I think it was, it says it on the bottom right of the page, or March 2020 of this year, I believe. So this recommendation sets out a metadata application profile to provide basic interoperability between systems producing or consuming machine actionable data management plans. This with a view to making it easier to exchange information regarding DMPs between relevant stakeholders. So for example, between funders and researchers themselves, and between institutions, etc. The full specification of the application profile is for the common standard. It's housed on GitHub, but the link is here on screen. And there's also, if you follow this link, there's also information on the organizations who have implemented the recommendation and those who are in the process of doing so at the moment. So far, this recommendation has been implemented at 11 different organizations, including here my own organization, the DCC, as part of our DMP online tool. In GitHub as well, there's a page containing a lot more of the resources developed by the working group, including a really useful list. A list I found was that of articles and publications that have been written and published by some of the working group co-chairs. So again, just turning our attention back to specific cases outlined in the adoption story, there are currently 4 adoption stories published on the RDA site based on this recommendation. The first is from the OpenAir Argos tool for DMPs. And this story describes how the DMPs produced using the Argos tool can be linked with other compliant DMP platforms. Another is from the Research Information Services provider Haplo. And this story outlines how the common standard aided in their work to embed DMPs in existing ethics, approval, and funding application processes. This story in particular is a really good example of the audio-visual sort of adoption stories that were started earlier on this year, where organizations and different projects were given the chance to submit recorded answers to questions or recorded interviews rather than the sort of traditional written adoption stories. Yep, the next adoption project was from the Norwegian Center for Data Research, for Research Data Management's DMP profile. And this outlines how the implementation of part of the common standard helped to distinguish, in their work to distinguish between project information and dataset information when completing a DMP. And finally, the fourth project was from, fourth adoption story is from EOSC Nordic. And this adoption story details the ongoing work to improve services for their main research communities in biodiversity, climate, and natural language processing domains. So as well as the usual channels to gather community input, the working group took a more novel approach to elicit feedback from the community. So towards the end of May earlier this year, there was a hackathon organized by the working group along with the RDA Austria node. So with the intention of applying the and testing the RDA Common Standard for machine actionable DMPs in a variety of settings. So there is a blog on site with the link to it on screen from Thomas Mixa, who was one of the working group co-chairs. This blog outlines the planning and the outcomes of the event. Some of the information this is on the steps that were taken in advance to encourage people to propose different topics to address during the hackathon, and how they managed to gather participants to work into groups to work together on these challenges. There was also a kind of a competition element to the event, which was judged on the collaboration, innovation, and the impact of the work done over the 2 days by the various groups taking part. Again, I think this is a really good example of where a working group and the resultant sort of recommendation have been able to harness and sort of build on the community connections to improve the impact and the standard of the group's work. Okay, so I think we are, yep, this is the last thing we'll just address briefly. So the final thing we'll look at today, just briefly, concerns the curriculum for foundational research data science skills for early career researchers, the recommendation of that. So this recommendation was set out by the RDA Co-Data Summer Schools in Data Science and Cloud Computing in the Developing World Working Group. And essentially, this sets out the curriculum for the successful RDA Co-Data Summer Schools. The first of these was held back in August 2016 at the Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste in Italy. And there have been about, I think, 15 or so held since then. So there is a catalogue of all past and future iterations of the school available on the Data Science School's website. The link is there on screen. So there's kind of two main reasons I thought it'd be worth sort of highlighting this one. So the first, just to acknowledge that one of the most recent schools was actually held in Costa Rica back in December 2019, was based at CNET. And who I think this organization is also involved in the hosting and running of this plenary here today. The second thing to note as well is just probably more relevant in terms of the times we find ourselves in, is the most recent iteration of this school was held as a virtual event. I think it was August, I may have got the date wrong, but I think it was August of this year, the most recent school was held. So yeah, the school, in this way, I guess the school can be seen as a sort of example of how these sort of focused online distance learning activities can be facilitated, with the recommendations also serving as the foundational material for the course and any future iterations of it, as well as just being a good example or model even of how to conduct these types of online learning events. There's a number of my colleagues here at the DCC have been involved with the data science schools for a number of years. They were telling me the most recent online school was different from previous versions in that, one, that it was held online, and two, that it had more of a sort of train the trainer aspect than previous iterations. So the previous school's alumni were encouraged to register and were given a recap as well as updates on each of the course modules. And the aim of this, again, was just to provide the alumni with tools to teach the content to others and to sort of and to ensure the kind of sort of strengthen sustainability really in each of their locales. There is, finally on this one, there's a really interesting adoption story on this recommendation for one of the schools that was held in South Africa at the start of this year in January 2020. So the link to the story again is on screen, and this link, again similar to one or two of the previous adoption stories, was also presented at the RDA Global Adoption Week in June. There's also a link to the recording of that session if you just follow that link that is on screen. So I think I've probably slightly overshot my time anyway. So yeah, just at the end of the presentation. So just before I wrap up, there's just a few things I thought would be worth highlighting for anybody who's interested in learning more about adoption and adoption of any of the RDA outputs. First, on the RDA website, there's the recommendations and outputs catalog, which allows you to search and sort of filter the 50 plus, I think it's 51 on the screen, says there, 51 recommendations and supporting outputs by discipline, by topic, and by domain, and by the endorsement status. On the screen as well, it's not on the screen here, but on this page, if you scroll down and look at each individual output, there should be a little link to a PDF with a card, which is like basically just a kind of quick summary of each of the outputs, which you can download. The summary is the outputs and solutions set out by each of the outputs. So secondly, I've been referring to the individual adoption stories throughout, but just to make you aware that they're all sort of displayed and housed together on the RDA site. So once if you're on the home page, you just hit recommendations and outputs, and when you see the drop down, just hit adoption stories, and that will take you there. When you're on this page, you'll see that there is a brief YouTube clip at the top of the page setting out the benefits of adopting RDA outputs. Also, there's the Submit Your Adoption Story Here button. So if there's anyone here who thinks they have an adoption story, or if they're interested in maybe finding out more about adoption, please feel free to get in contact with myself or anyone in the secretariat, and we're happy to sort of answer any questions or queries you have. Okay, so I think that is hope that's the end of my presentation. So thanks for listening, and hope you enjoy the rest. You've had a good plenary so far, and hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions. And I will hand back over to you, Hilary. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for that. A whirlwind tour of some of the RDA outputs adoption, and also the different ideas that and ways in which the community was engaged in either adopting or developing them. Two things I enjoyed from that was the community created and community driven, of course, and that's what we're all about. And also that they really did harness the openness and the consensus principles on which RDA is founded. And I think that's a great segue for me to now pass the baton to the founder and CEO of Ripeta, the former RDA US Executive Director, Leslie McIntosh-Borelli, who is going to lead you through the panel discussion on the COVID-19 phenomenal work that, when I think about it, I get all emotional. So I will pass the baton to Leslie, and thanks very much, Leslie, and thanks again, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for inviting me to moderate. I'm very happy to be here. Just a special thanks to the program committee in Costa Rica, gracias a Costa Rica, for doing this, and to my esteemed panelists who represent the dedication of the COVID-19 recommendation and guidelines on data sharing. They put in an enormous amount of work to this, and we are going to have the opportunity to highlight it. In this recommendation, there were 4 research areas and 4 cross-cutting themes. We're going to have a representative from each one of those present, plus 2, so that we can get a regional view from Costa Rica, and then also a special software presentation of navigating it. So to start this off, we are going to start with Dr. Claire Austin to give us a 2-minute overview of what you did in the epidemiology research area for this working group.
Thank you very much. The COVID-19 epidemiology subwork group produced recommendations and guidelines similar to all of the other work groups. We focused on data and the need for a coordinated systems, as has been raised by many other people, the need to emphasize open science and fair data. We also added ethical data and reproducible data to make it fairer data. In addition to the guidelines and recommendations, we produced 7 supporting outputs. We looked very closely at population level data sources. There are four preprints that were produced. The data sources, one on clinical population-based instruments looking at privacy, another on a model for looking at the interaction between health measures and economic measures and causal loops. And then there were 3 discussion papers that were produced looking at basically the idea of a coordinated system. We call one of them EpiTrax, a data framework for rapid detection and whole system response for emerging pathogens, and EpiStack, a framework for COVID-19 epidemiology data sets. Out of this, there has been a new work group created, the Epidemiology Common Standard for reporting surveillance data for communicable disease. And we are in the process of coordinating with CODATA for this new work group, and the case statement is currently in public, under public review. And I think I've probably used up more than my 2 minutes. Thank you.
You are absolutely perfect. Thank you so much. And now to talk about the clinical piece, could we, Dr. Anne Cabon-Thompson, would you mind telling us what you came out of?
Yes, of course, and I will do that on behalf of the group on clinical aspects. And this group had 2 moderators from Europe and 2 moderators from US, and I was the co-chair helping with this group. The first thing was that we had to make choices because the clinical aspects is a very wide scope. So we decided, and I think that we had input from the community on these aspects too, to concentrate on trustworthy sources for clinical trials. So the trustworthy repositories for clinical data are quite an important part of this of the recommendations. And this is very useful because that's the first thing you search for. There are problems with terminologies, for example. So to have to know where to refer to which terminology for the clinical areas was quite an important kind of work, and we benefited from quite a lot of competences in this domain. Then there was will work on clinical trials. And of course, at the moment when we were doing that, it was very important to, there were many clinical trials going on all over. For example, we insisted on the lawful fast-track approvals for these trials, keeping the quality and all the procedures, but with an acceleration of the procedures without abandoning all the principles for these clinical trials. And we then discussed, that was by the end, that if the recommendation had been in place, a number of discussions about, this example is known, the hydroxychloroquine use or not use, and now we have a lot of evidences from different clinical trials that this was not a good way to make the treatments. All the stuff that was going on would not have happened, actually. So I think this is an example that these recommendations and guidelines are actually useful.
Yes, thank you.
And then I
No,
think that I have probably used my 2 minutes.
Yeah, so but we're going to have time for more discussion later, so that will be good.
Okay. So,
okay.
so that's, I think, the 2 things I wanted to underline.
Thank you. Yes, no, that's very important. And I want to get to the discussion about how they can be used. So thank you. Now to hear about what the omics group did from a wonderful RDA member and library scientist, Ms. Natalie Myers.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see all of you here and to talk a little bit more about the COVID-19 working group recommendations and guidelines. The understanding of the ways in which the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes the COVID-19 disease is based on research into the molecular biology of processes at the cellular and subcellular level. The FAIR data principles address a primary concern that led to the formation of the RDA group of omics volunteers who wrote these guidelines. We were concerned about the availability and reusability of research data on COVID-19 in order to prevent unnecessary duplication of work. Our 80-some omics member contributors, who were co-moderated by Rob Hooft of Dutch Tech Center for Life Sciences and myself, were those with specialties related to cell and molecular biology, specifically virus genomics data, host genomics data, structural data, metabolomics, and lipidomics. The data of these types are the focus of the omics section of the RDA COVID-19 Working Group report. We emphasize that for most of the data modalities in COVID-19 omics research, the data can be deposited in aligned existing database resources, which we detail in the report, indicating if these resources are now particularly supporting specific COVID-19 subsets. Three overarching concerns for omics data sharing during the COVID-19 pandemic that we focused on were how reusability of data requires documented provenance, and how it's important to increase the reusability of data through consistent pre-processing, and how for researchers who may have existing SARS-CoV, MERS-CoV, or EBOV data that have not yet been made public, that we hope you will consider publishing that data now, as it can be a very useful reference. Finally, in a section particular to policymakers and funders, our section 4.3.2, we describe how due to the high cost involved with high throughput genomics, few data are available from low and middle income countries or from minority ethnic populations in high income countries, thus leading to improper extrapolation of results to unrepresented population groups. It's our hope that research that improves such coverage may warrant preferential funding, and we beg our funders and policymakers to consider this. That's a quick summary of the omics section and its content and our motivations. I look forward to our panel discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And that leads us right into the fourth research area, which is the social sciences, where we have Dr. Pienta to give us a brief overview of what you did in that research group.
Sorry, Leslie, this is Brian Pickering.
I'm sorry. Hi, Brian, Dr. Pickering, please.
Amy is traveling and unfortunately is not able to be here, but I'm glad to represent the group. Thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. Buenas tardes a Costa Rica. Just very briefly on social sciences, perhaps many people don't realize the importance of the social sciences when everything is focused in a pandemic around the clinical, the medical issues and the data. But what we looked at, specifically, and we had approximately 15 different disciplines within the group, representing lots of different geographies across the world, was to take something, for example, like the care principles. So sharing data and making sure that the data for social science, and so we're talking about anything from social media, but also statistical information, economic information during the pandemic, how to make those available, but also understandable to researchers in different areas. And so we focused on the way that the metadata should be set up, and we gave recommendations both to researchers and to funders to ensure that the necessary funding was there, but also focused on the sharing of these data and the interconnection of data across the social sciences, but also as they fit in with the medical and clinical. So that was where we focused in our particular bit. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Dr. Pickering, for that overview. So those are the 4 research areas, but there were 4 other cross-cutting themes. And so to hear about the community participation, we have Dr. Joanne Stocks.
So I was one of the community co-moderators, and thanks to the many contributions from RDA volunteers with a wide range of backgrounds and interests, the community participation working group evolved into a cross-cutting theme. And our recommendations were created with the aim of supporting the varied work of multiple stakeholders in sharing data to improve COVID-19 research outputs and public knowledge. And the guidelines we established aim to bridge the involvement of numerous invested stakeholders and communities. So there are many diverse parties who might not have collaborated together before, but now they're all actively responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we aim to suggest recommendations which will ensure that the inputs, whether from researchers, citizen scientists, app developers, or other device makers, are streamlined and take into account perspectives from patients, policymakers, and the public at large also being considered. And by linking these involved communities together and supporting communication, we hope that it'll help coordination and avoid duplication of efforts, since many of the communities are driving similar or complementary efforts in response to the current public health emergency. Our community participation guidelines and recommendations link with many of the other themes. For example, with the clinical theme, public express privacy concerns regarding the sharing of their medical data with stakeholders that aren't directly involved in their medical care. And whilst they acknowledge that this information and the data being combined, combining them in many cases is essential to enhance our knowledge in preventing and treating the disease. Another example of the cross-cutting links is with epidemiology, which is obtained through contact tracing apps. And there's also the related privacy concerns of sharing non-anonymized data. So to help address these concerns, one of our recommendation guidelines is to encourage public and patient involvement through the research data management lifecycle. So this could include involving patient ambassadors in the process of collecting the medical data, to involving the public representatives as data custodians. And we also acknowledge that there needs to be a considered balance between community safety and individual privacy concerns, timely testing and contact tracing in the response in this global emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that brings us now to the Indigenous data guidelines that were developed, and Dr. Stephanie Rousseau-Carroll is going to present on that.
Thank you, everybody. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm sitting here on Tohono and Pasquayaqui lands in Tucson, Arizona, and also acknowledge that we were meant to be sitting on the lands of the Indigenous peoples in Costa Rica. So the Indigenous COVID-19 data guidelines included fast-paced input to the last 2 versions from 9 Indigenous data scholars across the globe. The guidelines set the minimum requirements for Indigenous design data approaches, and these guidelines reflect and support Indigenous data sovereignty, are underpinned by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and are framed around the care principles for Indigenous data governance. They also speak to the need for fair data. These guidelines do not supersede or replace existing Indigenous governance protocols or agreements developed or under development by Indigenous peoples or nations. So as we've heard in some previous discussions, systemic policies and historic and ongoing marginalization have led to limitations in quality, quantity, access, and control for Indigenous peoples' COVID-19 data. These limitations point to the need for Indigenous peoples and nations to be engaged in governance on their own terms across COVID-19 data life cycles and throughout data ecosystems. Since data are critical for decision-making for and evaluation of pandemic planning, mitigation, and response, and Indigenous peoples' participation in data stewardship can increase the benefits of data use and decrease the harms, the involvement of Indigenous peoples with COVID-19 data is of paramount importance. We advance the following recommendations in addition to what we've put into the guidelines to enhance Indigenous peoples' access to and use of data across data life cycles and data ecosystems. So We asked for investments in Indigenous community-controlled data infrastructure and technology to support community capacity, response, and resilience. The involvement of Indigenous peoples, leaders, activists, and scholars in mainstream science, data, policy, nexus, decision-making processes. Institution of data access and data sharing protocols between Indigenous peoples and other governments and data holders. The collection and validation of Indigenous race, ethnicity, and or tribal affiliation. And finally, increasing the number of Indigenous epidemiologists to improve information for effective public health response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview. And as people can start hearing, there are already cross-cutting themes and overlap between these. We have the next two, which are going to be, we'll start with research software, and I think Dr. Shanahan is going to present on that. Professor Shanahan, excuse me.
Don't worry. Oh yeah, Leslie, thank you. Okay, so yeah, this is representation from the research software subgroup. There's two sort of general points that we kind of wanted to make, which is software very much represents a cornerstone with respect to reproducibility, which is absolutely key. So if you're interested in assembling a genome, then you need to know something about, you need to actually know what was the pipeline that was there to actually do all the computational steps to do that assembly. If you're doing epidemiology, some sort of simulation there, then you should be able to provide and make available the OR code that you wrote to do that simulation. The other point to note is that software is broad. It is not just thinking about operating systems or very, very broad packages such as NumPy or BLAST and such tools in that way. It's really down to the things that most people tend to go, oh, that's not terribly important, like a Python script or even an Excel macro. The subgroup had a broad set of recommendations for researchers, funders, and publishers. For researchers, I think in some respect it can be almost summarized to getting people to say to them, look, go on, use these fairly simple and straightforward ways of sharing your code. So develop your code, share it as you're going forward, release it under an open source license, and make sure that you deposit it in a repository either on its own or with your data with a PID. Funders need to support development and maintain and the maintenance of code and provide training in that. And finally, for publishers, require software citations in papers so that software gets the recognition that it deserves.
Thank you so much, Professor Shanahan, for that nice overview. And to tie this part up of the cross-disciplinary effort, we go to the legal and ethical group. I believe we have Councillor Alexander Bernier.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'd like to highlight first that that Anne and Brian were also part of the working group and were instrumental in bringing everything together. And essentially what we tried to do was we tried to help researchers navigate law and ethics, and especially data privacy law, in making their data accessible to the world. And unfortunately, what we found was that the contents of the law and the local practices regarding data sharing really aren't harmonized, that there is no one-stop shop or easy way of bringing together sources of data from a large number of countries in a streamlined fashion. So a lot of our guidance was aimed at helping people find the right actor in their institution, or giving them a critical and key list of things to think about and potential legal considerations that they might face in sharing their data. But beyond doing that, since the guidelines were actually published, we started looking more at ways of bridging gaps between different jurisdictions, between different ethical regimes, to really create standards across the entire health and research community for pooling that data together, especially in the context of an international emergency such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that the key takeaway that I really want to leave you all with, if there's one thing you retain from my talk, is that the solutions, they won't be legal or ethical in nature. They're actually going to be bringing together software, bringing together statistics, bringing together different ways of thinking about and looking at data, and making sure that when we design technologies, when we design databases, they're interoperable and that the policies really cohere with one another. So in the future, we've started publishing on legal decisions, such as the recent Schrems II decision of the European Commission. And really, we're hoping to publish more output that really looks at how can technology be integrated into common standards for data sharing across different communities, and how can legal standards be more reflective of the realities that researchers face in different jurisdictions without imposing unnecessary barriers.
Thank you. That brings up quite a few interesting things. Looking forward to the discussion. One of the things that we didn't specifically have in this group, but is very important to this plenary, is that Latin American perspective. And as one of the P16 organizers, we've invited Dr. Marcela Alfaro to come and talk a little bit about the Latin American perspective and the COVID. Marcela?
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for having me. I do want to highlight that I had no part in this amazing work, and that I'm amazed on looking at the document and the recommendations on the quality of work and the effort that this group has done is really remarkable. As a Latin American, and I think Dr. Juan Pane highlighted this morning, we have a lot to learn from this set of recommendations. And I would like to highlight the opportunity that we have as a region, Latin American region, and all our new RDA nodes that are shaping right now, to take these recommendations and create adoption cases. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for all those new nodes that are shaping in the region to get to work using the recommendations. The other part is, and I'm gonna continue with the words from Dr. Pane. It's finding those champions in our institutions and ministries, so these recommendations can shape new ways of working with COVID data, specifically in our region. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm just going to take a few seconds to echo what she just mentioned. The way that you start to adopt what these recommendations in RDA is simply to take the initiative. And honestly, if it weren't for Dr. Marcela Alfaro, I'm not sure we'd be in Costa Rica right now. She attended a summer school. She brought it back to Costa Rica. We started talking about maybe having the plenary then, and it has really flourished from there. So it is amazing the power of one person and what you can do. And it's amazing in this group what we've done for COVID, but also don't underestimate the power of one person to do something to make an impact. So please get involved. So thank you. And with that, we're actually going to go to a video, because one of the things, for those of you who've not read the recommendations, is there is a great executive summary, and then there's a long document to go with it with many details. And so navigating this is a bit of could be a challenge, but a few people have worked together to put in a tool to navigate, and there is a video by Dr. Damarwadian, who I think, though, we're just going to have it presented, or are you going to speak about it first?
No, it is presented. Yeah, and it's
Right.
not doctor.
Oh, sorry. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you. And I don't hear any audio yet, but it's a great picture.
I've got no control of the video playing at the moment, so yeah.
Oh, here we
Hi
go.
everybody. I wanted to give a quick overview of one of the tools we created as part of the working group for the RDA COVID-19 guidelines that was designed to help you quickly navigate the recommendations and extract the ones that are most relevant to you. The guidelines document is a comprehensive set of recommendations and caters for a range of stakeholders and user groups. And therefore, it's got 144 pages of recommendations that it has. Now, while comprehensive, it does pose the challenge to identify the specific guidelines that are relevant to you. These guidelines are spread across the document, and therefore it can be time-consuming to read and extract the information that you want. So in time-pressed situation, this is not ideal. So we wanted to come up with a way that will make it easier for you to access the specific guidelines that are most relevant to you. So to do this, we used a tool called DS Wizard that was created in the Czech Republic. It was originally designed for data stewardship documents or data management plans. But it was an ideal tool for this purpose as well. Now you can get a free account on this one. And once you've got the account, you can go into the project section to create your own profile for the guidelines you want to have. In there, you select the knowledge module as the RDA COVID-19 guidelines, which is the only one that's there, so that's quite easy at the moment. But in the future, we could have localized versions of it in there as well. Once you've done that, you will be presented with the view you can see up here that covers the different chapters in the guidelines. And for each chapter, it will ask you a set of yes or no questions. And by answering those questions, it will give you then just the exact recommendations that are most relevant to you. Once you've got that, you can then download that as a PDF and have the recommendations as your own personal version of the document. The RDA COVID-19 data sharing guidelines is a comprehensive set of guidelines document, and I think it's really worthwhile one to read on its own. However, if you are in a time pressure situation and you want just information, just the recommendations that are relevant to you, then you can use the DS Wizard tool to extract the information that you want.
Thank you so much. And if you don't mind putting that link in the chat as well so people could click on it, but not until after our wonderful panelists speak for just a little bit. So we have about 20 minutes left of the session, and we actually have quite a few questions ready for the group, which I don't think we're going to get to. But I'm going to start out with this first one, which is, this report was done and completed really in the middle of 2020. Here we are now in the second and third waves, and in some countries, we're just a booming first wave of the pandemic. How do you see that these recommendations really apply in our current state? And I'm going to leave the floor open to somebody who wants to take that one. Or
Leslie.
Yes.
Hi, Leslie. Yeah, I think I think in some respect the question needs to be turned around, which is in some respect right now we're looking in a position where certain countries, indeed continents are going through second, third wave, and others, notably East Asia, aren't. And in that respect, the issue there seems to be actually not so much the kind of medical interventions, but the social interventions that are going on there. Namely, East Asia is basically more used to being dealt with these things. Hence, actually, this is one of these really good examples of saying you tend to kind of look at the epidemiology, the bioinformatics and so on, but actually the social is probably just as important here. And hence the recommendations that are coming from the social sciences are not just that's a nice thing. It's an absolutely essential thing to learn from how do things work out there.
Thank you, Hugh, for that perspective. I actually think that brings up one of the critical pieces of learning. I mean, it hits at really what RDA is, and that is you are speaking from a software engineer talking about the importance of social sciences and the social aspect of community and how much this is important. And I would like to actually bring that into the next question, which is, you learn things from different groups and all of us, cross groups, but let's think about what you've learned from another group. And I will pick on somebody this time just so that we can keep this flowing. So Dr. Rousseau, do you mind talking about how either you believe the Indigenous data sovereignty applies to other groups or what you've learned from other groups that applies to your cross-cutting themes?
I think some of the most important learnings are the necessity for application of these cross-cutting themes across, but also thinking through the implications from such groups as omics and epidemiology to the recommendations and the actions that are taken for Indigenous data. I think, we see a lot of different layers. We do see uptake of technology and software for use in communities. And so we do want to support that and be able to implement some of the recommendations that have been made there and put those forth. We also see the need for increased engagement among different, so among epidemiology, social science, clinical, especially in some of our communities that are hardest hit. Because we have different layers of risk that are coming forth because of experiences that have been the result of settler colonialism in many instances, and the need for the ability to take advantage of some of the recommendations, but also kind of nest them together to think about how we really do serve communities by utilizing and applying all of them together. I think for us, that's been some of the deepest learning in the actual on-the-ground application.
Thank you for that wonderful insight. And I think as you mentioned, and reflecting back on what you said, Natalie Myers, you're in the omics group and you were talking about trust. And that's what you boiled down to. I don't know if you could just take a few minutes or a minute to say a little bit more about how the omics group came to really focus on trust.
There are members of the omics group among our panelists as well as myself, and I invite any of you to chime in who participated, Fotis and others. One of the things that we focused on related to trust was reticence to share and ways that technology can disincentivize sharing through penalties for keeping your data close to compute, and ways that we need to get better at sharing not just data, but right to results or right to analysis and the software which generates it.
So thank you for that. And that leads me into the next question, which is, we have these data, but a lot of the COVID-19 data or surveillance data, which could have issues with quality. So how do we trust that with so many issues? I mean, should we be using these data? And I know I have my own opinions on it, but I'm handing it over to the panelists. So if someone wants to talk about the quality of data and how that impacts the decisions that we make.
I guess I can take that, Claire. Well, yes, we know that we've seen that the COVID-19 data have a lot of quality issues. The kinds of data quality issues are really no different from what we see in other domains also. And we need to also recognize that no data are perfect. So what we need really are data of known quality according to specified criteria. So the question, can we trust the data? Well, the question has been raised, are the data somehow, have they somehow been manipulated? Well, as statisticians, we have ways of checking this, and that has been done. And by and large, I think we can say that the data have not been manipulated. The other question is, that rises often is, are they overestimating the cases and the deaths? And I would suggest that, if anything, they are underestimating cases and deaths. So the problem with the poor quality is that they're not providing the insight, the epidemiological insight that they could provide for decision makers and public health people to make better informed decisions than they are due to the state of the data. I hope that answers a little bit your question.
I think that answers quite a bit, and it actually leads into one of the next questions, which is moving over to the legal aspect. So I'm going to pick on Alex here first on how do you think that policymakers, regulators, and research institutions can help reduce regulatory barriers to further data sharing?
Thanks for that question. So I'd say the answer to that is really to lead by example. I think we've seen a lot of goodwill on the part of statistics agencies and regulators to take sources of data that usually wouldn't be accessible to the research community, such as clinical data, census data, things like that, and really make them accessible. And what we're seeing is that there aren't clear legal and policy channels to do that, and it's really ambiguous sometimes to regulators that might not be used to doing this kind of thing, how to do this with good data governance and with good ethical and legal guidance in place. And to that, I would really say that it's now left to the social sciences communities, the epidemiology communities, the health communities to really come forward with common models as to how this should be done in a way that respects the ethical obligations towards the individuals involved, and also make sure that everybody has access to the data that they need. The last thing I'd say to that is really that just from a regulatory standpoint, it shows legitimacy if you see that an entire health community across different disciplines, across different countries, across different ways of seeing the world are coming up with common and joint standards. And I think that's where institutions, organizations such as the Research Data Alliance really shine and really can put the leading foot forward, so to speak. Brian, Anne, I don't know if you'd have any interjections or thoughts to bring.
I wondered if I could pick up on something both that you said, Alex, and that Hugh had said, and also Natalie just now. Well, one of the benefits I see as far as the different groups that we have and the different sets of expertise that came together was, as Claire just mentioned now, there are techniques within individual disciplines to check for the quality of the data, for example. But what we needed, and what Alex mentioned before, was that one of the things the working group had to do was to pick up on all of the different information available to be able to make recommendations around governance. But going back to what Hugh said before, the importance of the work and the recommendations as they were produced is recognizing that we have, and I'm sorry to use the term, an ethical responsibility, both in each of the waves for the current pandemic, but also for future generations, to be able to bring everything together and to provide what we found during this pandemic to be the best set of recommendations. So it's really cutting across the available data, providing the governance to make those data available, but also providing all of the pieces that go with that data to be able to understand the cultural implications and mean that in future, different communities can actually benefit from that. So it's difficult to talk about any one piece because they all sit together and they provide a complete picture, which hopefully will be there in future as we're going forward.
Thank you for that. And I think that brings to the fact that you guys did an excellent job of taking something where you can see all of the interrelated pieces and yet picked them apart and scoped them so that they could be consumable, which is very important as well. I would like to take a second and have Anne reflect from the epidemiological perspective on what you think, back to the question on the regulatory. I mean, how do we have an impact with this from an epidemiological perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I think that one of the things which is of value in the document is all the different pieces. And one of the things we have seen in these pandemics is that we were not ready. We were taken short by this invasion by the virus. And so one thing that can be done now and in between the waves is actually in terms of training people, be ready, not only for politicians to take decisions, but for researchers and people in the clinical domain or the epidemiology to share. And the value of the document is that you can take even out of the moment when you need to do something about it and to share, to advance more quickly, to be prepared to share. And I think that one of the big value of this document is both for funders, for regulatory people doing decision in this domain, is to rely on this to be prepared, because we know that waves are coming, new waves, and that new pandemics will come. And that's something that can be done. And I would like in this discussion to insist on the fact that this recommendation needs to be used to be prepared when the things happen. And this is true for a clinical domain. It was said in another session today that at the moment when, well, you are in full speed of clinical care, it's difficult to think of all the different things that will make the quality of the data better and the ability to be shared more easily, unless you are prepared to do so by knowing where to find the standards and the number of technical tools that already exist and repositories and so on. So I would like to insist on the fact of using this recommendation out of the moment when you are in full crisis.
I think that's a very salient point. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, and I do want to switch just a little bit and make sure that Joanne, Priyanka, and Fotis, do you mind just talking, answering about, why did you decide to join the group? Why did you dedicate your time to this? Why would someone do that? And help us wrap up why people get engaged in this process.
Thanks, Leslie. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. You can go first.
Sure.
Priyanka, why don't you start?
Okay, sounds good. So I submitted, and thank you. Thanks for having me here. So I submitted an abstract for the 15th plenary session, and the abstract was on value of making data fair for infectious diseases. And that was before the pandemic happened. And after the pandemic happened, it all became really, very, very real for me, because I've been working in this space for quite some time now and kind of felt a little bit isolated because not a lot of people work as health informatics specialists in infectious diseases here in Australia. And after that, I was invited to give the keynote at the 15th plenary, and then I was invited to be one of the co-chairs of the working group. So it all made sense for me to use all the preparedness knowledge that I had gained by working with some experts here in Australia and then transferring all that knowledge back to this working group.
Thank you for that perspective. I think that takes us back to Seneca, who talks about being prepared for opportunities. So that is exactly what you were in doing this. Fotis, I think you were chiming in next.
Yeah, sure. And also thank you for having me here. So I think the easiest response I can give to this question is picking up on what Anne mentioned a bit earlier about training and the perception of the needs that we have right now. As we've been involved with research software and making research software fair for quite some time now, this sort of made a logical next step to ensure that this message that sharing software is a critical aspect in order to deal with all the challenges that this pandemic has brought forth. And this is one of the reasons that I sort of got involved in this whole effort. And I think it paid off eventually.
I think it's definitely paid off. Thank you. And so in the last minute, Joanne, do you have some final thoughts for us?
So the reason I got involved was one of my roles in my job is on public and patient involvement in research. So I thought that this could help with the community aspect. But as soon as the COVID pandemic began, I got involved with a hackathon, which was app developers trying to come up with a solution to help the pandemic. And these were these wonderful people that could make apps. And then as a medical person, I said, well, how about this with the data? How about this? And they hadn't considered any of that. And then when I heard about, I'm new to RDA just for doing COVID. I hadn't heard about you until then. And then I thought we need some guidelines to advise these people who are willing to give up their time to develop an app to help the response, but they haven't thought about what to do with the data and the privacy and everything, public concerns. So I thought this was a good tie-in for bringing all my interests together.
Well, thank you so much for spending the time. It's exactly what was needed. And we appreciate everybody who's been on this panel, everyone who has dedicated so much time. Thank you so much. I am going to turn this now over to Mary to wrap the session up. And again, thanks for the wonderful RDA adoption and your dedication. Mary?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm Mary O'Brien Almansick. I'm with the RDA US office and the Secretariat, and I'm here to close out the P16 adoption session. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Hillary for the lovely kick-in or lovely kickoff, I should say, and to Ryan O'Connor for the excellent highlights on the adoption cases, and to Leslie and the entire panel for your time today for this informative discussion. We greatly appreciate it. Okay, now I'm going to try to control the slides a little bit better. or not. There we go. So I want to pull your attention to some information that we have available on RDA COVID-19 resources. We've compiled some useful links on these slides that we will make available after the session, including how to find the recommendations and guidelines, as well as supporting outputs such as the DS Wizard navigation tool that Kieran presented on, and the Zotero reference library that is available as well. Also, the value of RDA for COVID-19 webpage that highlights updates on the work and its dissemination, and information on the associated working in subgroups. Also, please note we'll be sending out a brief survey on an adoption survey soon for the COVID-19 recommendations and guidelines, and we greatly appreciate your feedback to help us assess its impact. Just real quickly here, I know we're out of time, but I just want to go over a little bit of information for you. Since we're talking adoption, I want to remind you of the different RDA assets and where to find them. We currently have 21 flagship recommendations and 24 supporting outputs, with 6 more in the review process. These are the RDA standards and supporting resources that have gone through endorsement and/or community review processes. but note that groups can also have assets in the form of other outputs and supporting materials. The RDA website has a lovely output catalog with filtering options, which Ryan showed you earlier. And so please go online and give it a test drive if you haven't done that already. Lastly, we have 142 documented adoption cases in various domains, organizations, and countries. If you would like to share your group's adoption efforts as a learning tool for our international community, please be sure to use our submission form or write to inquiries@rda-alliance.org. As always, if you need more information to aid in your implementation of a solution, our team at the inquiries email is there to help. And lastly, I want to remind you all how important it is to vote and have our votes counted. So please remember to vote in the tab elections that are going on right now. The RDA website has more details for you. And we'll also hope to see you at the next breakout sessions, and as well as the networking session that we have tonight on recipe sharing. So thank you and gracias for attending this session, and as well as for your ongoing support of the RDA and its mission.
Thank you, Mary. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.